December 17, 1944. A wooden post in a Belgian village square. A man tied to it, shivering. A sign around his neck. One word in charcoal. Fiend. Enemy. This is where two soldiers, one German, one American, both prisoners of their own armies, would meet at the edge of civilization's collapse. Hauptmann Ernst Müller had seen enough war to know when something was wrong. The village of St. Vith's outskirts lay half devoured by artillery fire, smoke rising from collapsed roofs like the dying breath of something ancient and beyond saving. The December fog was thick enough to taste, metallic and cold, carrying the scent of cordite and wet ash. His Kubelwagen rattled over frozen ruts, suspension groaning with every impact, followed by a canvas-covered truck carrying 6 Wehrmacht soldiers tasked with organizing the chaos left by the offensive's first wave. 48 hours into Operation Wacht am Rhein, the roads were clogged with Panther tanks, their engines roaring like industrial dragons, half-tracks spewing diesel exhaust into the frozen air, and columns of prisoners stumbling westward in the cold. American soldiers, thousands of them captured when the 106th Infantry Division collapsed under the weight of 3 German armies. Young men, most of them barely trained, sent to a quiet sector to gain experience before the real fighting. They had gained experience, all right. They had learned what it meant to be overrun by veterans who had survived Russia and knew every trick of winter warfare. Müller was 45 years old. He had survived Verdun as a boy, his 16th birthday spent in a trench watching poison gas roll across no man's land, like a green tide of death. He had survived North Africa as a man, fighting under Rommel when the Desert War still felt like something clean, almost honorable, tank against tank, open ground, no civilians to worry about. And he had survived the Eastern Front as something older than either boy or man, something worn down to bare function, a machine that followed orders because the alternative was madness. His face was wind-scarred, deep lines carved around his eyes and mouth, and his uniform was properly pressed despite 3 days without sleep. Discipline. It was all he had left. His orders were clear. Establish a collection point for American POWs. Conduct preliminary interrogation according to Geneva Convention protocols, and arrange transport to Dulag Luft Oberursel for formal processing. The Luftwaffe ran the interrogation center with bureaucratic efficiency, treating it like an industrial sorting facility. Prisoners came in, information was extracted through psychological pressure and careful conversation, and then they were catalogued, photographed, registered with the Red Cross and shipped to permanent camps. Stalag Luft III for airmen, Stalag Muid B for enlisted infantry. The system worked because everyone followed the rules. Rules were the only thing separating war from slaughter. Feldwebel Klaus Brenner sat beside him in the Kubelwagen, a wiry man of 30 with a Saxon accent that reminded Müller of home. Dresden before the war, before everything. Brenner's hands were never still, always fidgeting with something, a cigarette, a map, the strap of his rifle. Nervous energy. He had been in Russia too, and Russia left marks on men that never healed. Hauptmann, Brenner said, voice tight, the SS came through here 6 hours ago. 12th Panzer, Hitler Jugend Division. They were in a hurry. Müller nodded without speaking. The Waffen-SS moved like storm fronts, fast and brutal, leaving debris in their wake. The 12th SS Panzer Division Hitler Jugend was particularly notorious. Young fanatics, most of them teenagers when they enlisted, trained to see the war as a racial crusade rather than a military operation. They fought viciously and took few prisoners. When they did take prisoners, the results were unpredictable. Sometimes they followed procedure. Sometimes they didn't. Müller had learned to clean up after them in Russia, where the line between combat and atrocity had dissolved entirely in the snow and mud and endless partisan warfare. Here in Belgium, the illusion of a civilized war was supposed to hold. Western Front. Rules of engagement. The Americans and British took German prisoners and fed them, sent Red Cross parcels, followed the 1929 convention to the letter. In return, Germany was expected to do the same. The High Command insisted on it, partly for diplomatic reasons, neutral nations were watching, and partly because German POWs in Allied hands received better treatment when Germany reciprocated. But the SS played by different rules. Their rules. The Kubelwagen turned into the village square, tires crunching over broken glass and frozen mud. Müller saw the church first. Gothic stone, probably 12th century, its spire broken halfway up, stained glass scattered like frozen tears across the cobblestones. Someone had painted a swastika on the main doors, crude and dripping, graffiti of conquest. Then he saw the post. A man was tied to it. Müller raised his hand sharply. The convoy stopped, engines idling. He stepped out, boots crunching on frost, breath misting in the air, and walked forward slowly. Each step felt heavier than the last, as if the ground itself was trying to hold him back, warning him not to look too closely at what his own army had done. The man was an American soldier, that much was obvious. Torn uniform, olive drab turned gray with mud and ash and the general filth of combat. His hands were bound behind the post with wire, not rope. Wire, the kind used for field telephone lines which cut into the wrists and left dark stains on frozen skin. His helmet was gone, probably taken as a souvenir. His head hung forward, but his eyes tracked Müller's approach with the wary intelligence of a trapped animal calculating its chances. Around his neck, suspended by twine, was a wooden placard. Someone had written on it in charcoal, the letters large and crude: Fiend, Enemy. Müller stopped 3 meters away. He had seen men tied to posts before, partisans in Ukraine strung up in village squares as warnings to anyone who thought about resisting the occupation, deserters in Poland, shot at dawn and left hanging for a day before burial. But this was different. This was theater, public display, a warning to the Belgian civilians who were already hiding in their cellars. This is what happens to enemies of the Reich. This is what protection looks like when it comes from the wrong side. The soldier raised his head slowly, muscles trembling with the effort. He was young, mid-20s, with skin the color of dark oak, and eyes that held no hope, only calculation, the mathematics of survival. His lips were cracked and bloodless, splitting at the corners where the cold had drawn all moisture out. Frostbite had begun to mottle his cheeks in pale patches that would turn black if left untreated. His breathing was shallow, controlled, conserving energy. Smart. Feldwebel, Müller said quietly, not taking his eyes off the prisoner. Brenner appeared at his shoulder, rifle slung across his chest. Who did this? The SS, Hauptmann. Like I said, they left him here as an example. An example of what, exactly? Brenner hesitated, glancing at the prisoner, then back at Müller. His voice dropped lower. He's one of the black ones, from the American colored units. The SS said he was found hiding in a barn with 3 others. They shot the others on the spot. This one they decided to make a point with. Müller felt something cold settle in his stomach, colder than the December air. He had heard rumors of Negro troops in the American army, segregated battalions, mostly support roles according to intelligence reports, though some artillery and service units. The propaganda ministry painted them as savages, criminals released from American prisons and given uniforms, rapists and murderers unleashed on civilized Europe. Goebbels had written entire pamphlets about it, lurid fantasies designed to justify whatever came next. Müller had stopped listening to Goebbels years ago, around the time he realized that every enemy was painted as subhuman, right before you were ordered to treat them as less than human. First the Poles, then the Russians, then the Jews, now this. He looked at the man again. The soldier's dog tags hung outside his jacket, frozen against his chest, 2 metal rectangles catching the weak afternoon light. Müller stepped closer, close enough to read the embossed letters. Hayes, James L. 357888264, TP. Corporal Hayes, Müller said in English. His accent was thick, shaped by years of classroom instruction and field interrogations, but clear enough. 333rd Field Artillery Battalion. Hayes said nothing. His eyes tracked Müller's every movement, looking for the blow, the kick, the next humiliation. Waiting. Müller turned to Brenner. His voice was flat, stripped of emotion, the voice of a man giving routine orders. Cut him down. Bring him to the church basement. Get a blanket and water. Clean his wounds. Hauptmann. The SS left specific orders. The SS, Müller interrupted, his voice hardening just enough to make it clear this was not a discussion. Are not here. I am. This is now a Wehrmacht operation, and we follow Wehrmacht procedures. Prisoners of war are to be detained humanely pending transport to designated interrogation facilities. Those are the regulations. Follow them, Feldwebel. Brenner's jaw worked for a moment. Then he nodded sharply. Jawohl, Hauptmann. Two soldiers approached with wire cutters, working quickly, their faces carefully blank. Professional. Don't think about it, just follow orders. The wire parted with small pinging sounds and Hayes collapsed forward into their arms, legs buckling. They carried him toward the church, his boots dragging twin lines through the frost. Miller watched the sign swing on its twine, that single word smeared in charcoal, and felt the old exhaustion settle deeper into his bones, down where it lived permanently now, a weight he would carry until the day he died. This was not his first moral compromise. It would not be his last. But protocols existed for a reason. Even in war, especially in war, men needed rules to separate themselves from animals. Once you abandoned the rules, once you decided that some men did not deserve the protections afforded to others, then everything became permissible. Müller had seen where that road led. He had walked it in Russia, watching villages burn, watching reprisal executions, watching the Einsatzgruppen follow behind the Wehrmacht and do the work that soldiers were not supposed to do. He had told himself then that he was just following orders, that he was a soldier, not a murderer, that the SS and the Einsatzgruppen were responsible for the atrocities, not the Wehrmacht. But he had known. They had all known. Inside the church basement, the air was warmer, heated by a small iron stove someone had set up in the corner. The basement had been converted into a makeshift processing center. Field desk, kerosene lamp, a stack of intake forms printed in triplicate on thin paper that always smudged. Miller's job was simple, at least on paper. Name, rank, unit, circumstances of capture. The information would be forwarded to division, then corps, then eventually to the International Committee of the Red Cross in Geneva, who would notify the American government that Corporal James L. Hayes was a prisoner of war and entitled to certain protections under international law, assuming he survived long enough to be processed. Assuming the SS did not come back. They laid Hayes on a wooden bench against the stone wall. Someone had already brought a blanket, Wehrmacht issue, gray wool, scratchy but warm. Brenner brought water in a tin cup, and Hayes drank slowly, his throat working against the cold metal. His wrists were ringed with cuts dark and deep, the wire having dug through skin down to tendon. Brenner cleaned them with water and wrapped them in strips of cloth torn from a spare undershirt. Field medicine. Inadequate, but better than nothing. Müller sat across from Hayes at the field desk, folding his hands on the scarred wood surface. He studied the man for a long moment. Hayes stared back, expressionless, waiting to see what came next. I am Hauptmann Müller, Wehrmacht, Müller began, speaking slowly and clearly in English. You are now a prisoner of the German armed forces. Under the Geneva Convention of 1929, you are required to provide your name, rank, and serial number. Nothing more. You are not required to answer questions about military operations, unit strength, or strategic objectives. Do you understand? Hayes looked at him for a long moment as if trying to determine whether this was another trick, another psychological game. Then he spoke, his voice raw from exposure and thirst but steady underneath. Hayes, James L. Corporal, 357-8264. Your unit was the 333rd Field Artillery Battalion? Hayes said nothing. You were captured near Schönberg during the initial assault? Silence. There were others captured with you? Hayes's jaw tightened, but he did not speak. Müller nodded slowly. This was expected. Proper. A soldier's duty was to resist interrogation, to give only what the convention required and nothing more. Müller respected that. He had trained German soldiers in the same protocols. If captured, reveal nothing of value. Name, rank, serial number. Let the enemy work for every scrap of information. He wrote the basic information on the intake form, his handwriting neat and precise despite the cold that made his fingers stiff. He added the date and time, noted the condition, frostbite on extremities, minor lacerations to wrists, dehydration, possible exposure-related hypothermia. Recommended immediate transfer to Dulag Luft Oberursel for medical evaluation and formal interrogation by trained Luftwaffe intelligence officers. You will be transported tomorrow morning, Müller said, setting down his pen. You will be treated in accordance with international law. You will be given food, water, and medical attention. You will be allowed to send notification to your family through the Red Cross. These are your rights as a prisoner of war. Hayes's expression did not change. That what you call this? International law? Miller met his eyes. You were found in violation of proper detention procedures. I have corrected that violation. You corrected it. Hayes's voice was flat, emotionless, but something sharp moved beneath the surface. Man ties me to a post like a dog, leaves me to freeze with a sign that says I'm the enemy. And you think cutting me down fixes it? I think, Miller said carefully, measuring each word, that you are alive. In this war, Corporal Hayes. That is not nothing. Hayes leaned back against the stone wall, his eyes never leaving Miller's face. You know what happened to the others, don't you? The ones they caught before me. Miller's jaw tightened. He said nothing. They shot them. Hayes continued, his voice still flat, still controlled. Lined them up and shot them, after they surrendered. After they put their hands up, because we were black. That's the only reason. Not because we fought hard, not because we killed Germans, because we were black. Miller set the pen down slowly. He had heard the rumors. Brenner had mentioned something about executions near a place called Wereth, a farmhouse a few kilometers south. 11 men from the 333rd, all Negro soldiers found with hands bound, beaten, shot in the head or chest at close range. Execution style. The reports were vague, deliberately so, but Miller had learned to trust the shape of silence. Atrocities left echoes in the way men talked or refused to talk about what they had seen. I know, he said finally, the words costing him something, that my orders are to process prisoners for transport to designated camps. That is what I intend to do. Hayes studied him with an intensity that was almost physical, as if trying to see through skin and bone to whatever lived underneath. Your orders. Right. Where I come from, Hauptmann. Orders don't mean much when the man giving them decides you're not worth following them for. I've been hearing about orders my whole life. Orders that say I can't drink from the same fountain as a white man. Orders that say I sit in the back of the bus. Orders that say I'm 3/5 of a person, less than human property. So forgive me if I don't put much faith in your orders. Miller stood abruptly, the chair scraping against stone. He felt something dangerous rising in his chest. Not anger exactly, but something close to it. Recognition, perhaps. The recognition that this man understood something Miller had spent years avoiding, that orders were only as good as the men who gave them, and that systems built on inequality would always find ways to justify cruelty. You will be transported in the morning, Miller said, his voice tight. Rest while you can. He left before Hayes could reply, before the conversation could go any further into territory that felt like quicksand, pulling him down toward questions he did not want to answer. Outside, the fog had thickened to the point where visibility was measured in meters rather than kilometers. Brenner was organizing a perimeter, posting guards at the village's eastern approach where the road curved toward the German lines. Miller walked to the Kubelwagen and retrieved a cigarette from his coat, lighting it with hands that shook slightly. He had stopped smoking in North Africa, started again in Russia, and never managed to quit. The cigarette was Turkish tobacco, part of a care package from months ago, and it tasted like burned paper and regret. The war had taught him many things. Among them, that rules were fragile agreements between men who preferred order to chaos, and that chaos was always closer than anyone wanted to admit. That the difference between civilization and barbarism was thinner than anyone liked to believe. That good men could do terrible things when they convinced themselves they were following orders, serving a greater cause, protecting their nation. He thought of his son, Klaus, buried somewhere in the frozen rubble of Stalingrad, 20 years old, a believer, one of the true believers who had joined the Hitler Youth and absorbed every word of the propaganda, who had volunteered for the Eastern Front because he thought the Reich was building a new world. He had died in that new world, frozen or shot or blown apart. Miller had never learned the details, just the telegram that said his son was dead and that his sacrifice would be remembered forever. It would not be remembered. None of them would be remembered except as numbers, statistics. A generation of young men fed into the machinery of war and ground down to nothing. Klaus had believed in the racial theories, the pseudoscience that divided humanity into hierarchies of worth. He had believed that Germans were destined to rule, that Slavs were meant to serve, that Jews were parasites to be eliminated. Miller had never believed in any of it, but he had not argued either. He had let his son believe because it seemed easier than fighting, and now Klaus was dead, and Miller lived with the knowledge that his silence had been a kind of permission. He finished the cigarette and crushed it under his boot. watching the ember die in the frost. Night fell over the Ardennes like a curtain dropping on a stage, sudden and complete. In the church basement, Hayes lay on the bench and stared at the vaulted ceiling, counting the cracks in the stone. 83 cracks, some thin as spider silk, others wide enough to see darkness beyond. His wrists throbbed with each heartbeat, a steady rhythm of pain that kept him focused, kept him present. His feet were numb, no feeling past the ankles, and he wondered distantly if he would lose toes to frostbite. He had been cold before. Mississippi winters could be bitter, especially in the delta where the wind came off the river and cut through everything. But this was different. This was the kind of cold that seeped into your bones and whispered that you would never be warm again, that this was how you would die, slowly freezing while the world moved on without you. He thought of the other men from the 333rd, the ones who had scattered when the Germans broke through the line, tanks appearing out of the fog like metal ghosts, guns firing, men screaming. He had seen Willie Davis take a bullet in the back as he ran across an open field, arms windmilling, falling face first into the snow. He had heard Thomas Stewart screaming in a ditch until the screaming stopped abruptly, cut off by a sharp crack that echoed across the frozen landscape. And he had walked past a farmhouse near Wereth where the bodies lay in the snow. 11 men he knew. Execution style, hands still bound behind their backs. The Germans had killed them because they were black, not because they were soldiers, not because they had fought well or poorly, because they were black. And the Germans had decided that black men in uniform were not real soldiers, were not protected by the rules of war, were not human enough to deserve mercy. Hayes had grown up in the Mississippi Delta, where white men burned crosses in fields and black men disappeared for looking at a white woman the wrong way. He had learned early that survival meant knowing when to speak and when to stay silent, when to fight, and when to bow your head and swallow your pride and live to see another day. The Army had promised him a uniform would make him equal. That service to his country would earn him respect. Fort Huachuca had taught him that segregation followed you even into war, that black soldiers trained separately, ate separately, fought separately, and were expected to be grateful for the opportunity to die for a country that treated them like second-class citizens. And now, tied to a post with a sign around his neck, he understood that the enemy was not just the Germans. The enemy was anyone who decided you were less than human, and that could be anyone, anywhere, at any time. The door creaked open. Miller entered, carrying another wool blanket and a piece of bread wrapped in paper. He set them on the bench without a word and turned to leave. "Why'd you cut me down?" Hayes asked. Mueller paused at the door, his hand on the frame. He did not turn around. "It is procedure." "Procedure." Hayes laughed, a bitter sound that scraped against the stone walls. "You think procedure's gonna keep me alive? You think those SS boys care about procedure?" "I think," Mueller said slowly, still not turning, "that without procedure, without rules, none of us are anything but killers. We are animals tearing at each other in the dark. The rules are all that separate us from that. The rules." Hayes unwrapped the bread, stale and hard but edible. "The rules say I'm 3/5 of a person back home. The rules say I can't vote in Mississippi. The rules say I fight in a separate unit because white soldiers don't want to serve with me. So forgive me, Hauptmann, if I don't share your faith in rules." Miller finally turned, and in the lamplight, his face looked older than his 45 years, carved from something tired and gray. "Then perhaps we are both prisoners, Corporal Hayes. You of your army's rules, and I of mine." He left before Hayes could respond. Hayes wrapped the second blanket around his shoulders and ate the bread slowly, chewing carefully because his jaw ached from shivering. He closed his eyes and tried to sleep, but every time he drifted off, he saw the sign again. Find. Enemy. The word had been burned into his mind, carved into his soul with the same crude charcoal strokes. He wondered if the German officer understood. Probably not. Men like that, men who believed in rules and order and the fundamental fairness of systems, never understood that the rules were written by people who never intended to protect you in the first place. The rules protected those who made them. Everyone else had to survive in the gaps. Morning came gray and cold, the sky pressing down like wet concrete. Mueller was writing transport orders at the field desk when Brenner knocked on the church door, his face pale, eyes wide with something like fear. "Hauptmann, we have a problem." Mueller looked up from the paperwork, pen pausing mid-word. What kind of problem? The SS are back. The pen stopped moving entirely. Mueller set it down carefully, precisely, buying himself a moment to think. Where are they? Village Square. 3 soldiers and an officer. They're asking about the American prisoner. The black one. Mueller stood and buttoned his coat slowly. Each button a small ritual, a moment of preparation. He adjusted his belt, checked that his sidearm was secure in its holster. Not that he would use it, but the weight was comforting. Then he walked out into the square and found them waiting like a tribunal. 3 SS soldiers in mottled camouflage smocks, their weapons slung casually across their chests, and an officer standing in front. The officer was young, maybe 29, with the sharp features and cold eyes of a true believer. His uniform was impeccable despite the mud and chaos of the offensive, his boots polished, his collar emblazoned with the twin lightning bolts of the SS. SS Obersturmführer, the rank insignia indicated. First lieutenant equivalent, though SS ranks operated in their own parallel hierarchy, often wielding authority beyond their nominal position. Hauptmann Müller? The officer smiled, but it was the smile of a predator showing teeth. I am Obersturmführer Werner Kohl. I believe you have something that belongs to me. Müller saluted, crisp and correct. Protocol. Always protocol. It was armor. Thin as paper, but sometimes enough to deflect. I am processing prisoners for transport to Dulag Luft Oberursel, Obersturmführer. All procedures are being followed according to Wehrmacht regulations and Geneva Convention requirements. Kohl's smile widened, showing more teeth. Procedures. Yes, the Wehrmacht does love its procedures. Forms in triplicate. Everything documented. Very German. Very orderly. He stepped closer, hands clasped behind his back. His posture relaxed, but his eyes sharp as broken glass. The Negro you found yesterday. I left him in the square for a reason. He is a prisoner of war, Mueller said, keeping his voice neutral, professional. Under the Geneva Convention, he is entitled to... Entitled? Kohl laughed, a sound like ice cracking. Hauptmann, surely you understand. These are not ordinary prisoners. They are racially inferior combatants. The Führer has made it explicitly clear that such individuals do not fall under standard protections. They are to be treated as threats to racial purity, as enemies of the Reich at the biological level. Mueller felt the familiar weight settle in his chest, the exhaustion mixing with something darker. He had heard this argument before on the Eastern Front, where Soviet commissars and Jews were separated from regular POWs and sent to camps that were not camps but killing grounds. The logic was always the same. They are not like us. Therefore they are not protected. Therefore they can be disposed of. The Geneva Convention, Mueller said carefully, choosing each word like a man navigating a minefield, makes no distinction based on race. A uniformed soldier of a recognized military force is entitled to protection as a prisoner of war. That is international law. Kohl's smile vanished. International law. The Geneva Convention, treaties signed by weak men who believed in equality, in the fundamental sameness of all humans. We know better now, don't we, Hauptmann? We have learned through science and observation that nature itself demands hierarchy. The strong rule. The inferior serve, or are eliminated. It is the natural order, written into the very structure of biology. I follow military law, Mueller said, hearing his own voice go flat, stripped of inflection. Not philosophy, not biology, military law. Military law is what I say it is. In this sector, at this moment. Kohl's voice hardened, losing all pretense of civility. The prisoner will be transferred to my custody. He will be sent to a facility appropriate for his kind. Not a stalag, not a prisoner of war camp. Somewhere more suited to his nature. Perhaps a labor camp. Perhaps something else. That is not your concern. A concentration camp. Kohl was not even pretending otherwise. He was stating it plainly, confident in his authority, in the power structure that placed ideological purity above military protocol. Mueller met his eyes and made a decision that would cost him everything. I have already processed the paperwork. He is listed for Dulag Luft Oberursel. The Luftwaffe has jurisdiction over all aircrew and artillery personnel under current regulations. The paperwork has been filed with division. It cannot be reversed without authorization from Corps-level command. Aircrew? Kohl's eyebrows rose. Hauptmann, the Americans do not allow Negroes to fly. Everyone knows this. Their racial policies are almost as strict as ours in some respects. He is listed as support personnel for the 333rd Field Artillery Battalion, Miller said, his voice steady despite the pounding of his heart. Artillery units fall under air-ground coordination protocols. Forward observers, fire direction control, liaison with aerial reconnaissance. Therefore, Luftwaffe jurisdiction applies. It is a technicality, but it is in the regulations. It was a lie, a bureaucratic fiction. Artillery support personnel were Wehrmacht jurisdiction, not Luftwaffe. But it was the kind of lie that might work, because the German military machine ran on paperwork and jurisdictional disputes. The Wehrmacht and Luftwaffe and SS were constantly fighting over resources, authority, prisoners, and the Luftwaffe guarded its authority jealously, particularly regarding Dulag Luft, which was run as a model facility to demonstrate German compliance with international law. Neutral observers visited it. Red Cross inspectors praised it. It was propaganda, but it was also real. Prisoners sent there were processed correctly, treated according to the rules, registered properly. Cole stared at him for a long moment. Around them, the fog swirled, muffling sound, turning the world gray and uncertain. Finally, Cole smiled again. But this time there was no warmth in it, no pretense. It was the smile of a man filing away information for later use. Very well, Hauptmann. Procedures, bureaucracy, the Luftwaffe's precious jurisdiction. I understand completely. He stepped closer until they were less than a meter apart, close enough that Mueller could smell the cigarette smoke on his breath. But understand this. There are lists being made. Lists of officers who forget which side they serve, of men who place legal niceties above loyalty to the Reich, of those who obstruct the necessary work of racial purification because they cling to outdated notions of military honor. Your name, Hauptmann Müller, is now on such a list. He turned and walked away, his soldiers following, their boots striking the cobblestones in unison. Müller watched them disappear into the fog and felt the cold settle deeper into his chest, all the way down to where his son's ghost lived. He had bought time, nothing more, and he had marked himself as unreliable, politically suspect, an obstacle to be removed when convenient. Inside the church, Müller found Hayes sitting up, his wrists bandaged with strips of cloth that were already spotted with blood. Brenner stood nearby, rifle in hand, watching the prisoner with professional wariness. Müller waved him out and sat down heavily across from Hayes. You leave tonight, Müller said without preamble. There is a transport convoy heading north to Oberursel at 400 hours. You will be on it. Hayes looked at him steadily. The SS want me. The SS want many things. They will not have you. Not if the paperwork is filed correctly. Paperwork. Hayes almost smiled. That's what's going to save me? Paperwork? In this army, yes. The bureaucracy is its own kind of weapon. If your name is on the right list, in the right file, going to the right place, then changing that requires authorization, countersignatures, justification. It creates friction, delays, and in those delays, you survive. Why? Hayes's voice was quiet but intense. Why are you doing this? Müller was silent for a long moment. He thought of Klaus, his son, who had believed in the racial theories until the day he died. He thought of the orders he had followed in Russia, the villages that burned, the reprisals, the mass graves that were called partisan suppression operations in the reports. He thought of all the lines he had watched others cross, all the times he had told himself he was just following orders, just doing his duty, just one man in a vast machine who could not possibly make a difference. Because, he said finally, the words costing him something precious, I have followed too many orders that I knew were wrong. I have done too many things that cannot be undone. But this one thing, I can do. This once I can follow the right order, even if I have to invent it myself. Hayes studied him with an intensity that felt like judgment. You think one good deed makes up for the rest? No, Müller said simply, but it is what I can do. And perhaps it is enough to let me die as something more than just another killer in a uniform. You think you're going to die? I think, Müller said, standing, that I signed my death warrant the moment I defied the SS. But that was my choice. Your choice is simpler. Survive. Get to Oberursel. Follow the procedures. Give them nothing but name, rank, and serial number. They will try psychological tricks, but the Luftwaffe follows the rules. Eventually, you will be sent to a stalag. Stay alive there. The war cannot last forever. Survive until the end. He left before Hayes could respond, before the weight of what he had done could settle fully on his shoulders. That night, under cover of darkness and fog, Miller personally loaded Hayes onto a transport truck with 11 other American prisoners, young men from the 106th Infantry Division, white soldiers with scared eyes and dirty faces. They stared at Hayes with a mixture of confusion and discomfort, and Hayes understood. Even among fellow Americans, even among fellow prisoners, he was separate, apart. The war had not changed that. Nothing would change that. Miller handed the driver a sealed envelope containing falsified transport orders. Dulag Luft Oberursel, priority processing. These prisoners are classified as aircrew support personnel. Luftwaffe jurisdiction explicitly invoked. Do not deviate from the route, do not stop except for fuel. If anyone questions you, refer them to the authorization codes in the envelope. The driver, an older man who looked tired enough to accept anything without question, nodded and started the engine. Miller watched the truck pull away, red taillights fading into the fog like dying embers, and knew he had crossed a line he could not uncross. The SS would discover the deception eventually. They would check records, trace the paperwork, realize what he had done. And when they did, there would be consequences. But for now, in this moment, one man would live who otherwise would have died, and in a war measured in millions of dead, perhaps one life was meaningless, or perhaps it was everything. 3 days later, Corporal James L. Hayes arrived at Dulag Luft Oberursel. The facility was located near Frankfurt, a purpose-built interrogation center surrounded by barbed wire and guard towers, but run with bureaucratic efficiency. He was processed by Luftwaffe intelligence officers who spoke perfect English, who offered him cigarettes and hot coffee, who asked questions designed to extract information through psychological manipulation rather than physical torture. He gave them his name, rank, and serial number. Nothing more. He repeated it like a mantra. Hayes, James L., Corporal, 357-8264. They photographed him. They gave him a prisoner number. They registered his name with the International Red Cross. They put him in a solitary cell for 3 days of intensive interrogation, probing for weak points, testing his resolve. He said nothing beyond the required information. Finally, they gave up and processed him for permanent camp assignment. On December 23, 1944, Hayes was transferred to Stalag 7A near Moosburg, a sprawling prisoner of war camp that held nearly 20,000 Allied prisoners. It was a city of barracks and mud, surrounded by wire and watchtowers, but it followed the rules. Prisoners received Red Cross parcels. They were allowed to write letters home, censored but delivered. They organized educational classes, theatrical performances, escape committees. They survived. Hayes was placed in a segregated barracks with other Negro POWs, men from service units, a handful of Tuskegee airmen shot down over Austria, a medic from the 92nd Infantry Division. They were separated from the white prisoners, given smaller rations, assigned the worst work details. Even as prisoners, segregation followed them, but they were alive. The Germans treated them as POWs, not as racial enemies. They survived the winter, the bombing raids, the forced march west as the Reich collapsed. On April 29, 1945, Hayes stood in the camp yard and watched American tanks roll through the gates, the white star on their hulls blazing like salvation. He wept, not from joy exactly, but from the sheer overwhelming relief of having survived when so many had not. He went home to Mississippi. He returned to a country that still made him sit at the back of the bus, drink from separate fountains, call white men sir, whether he wanted to or not. He spent 40 years working in a cotton mill, married, raised 3 children, buried his wife in 1982. He never talked about the war except to say he had been captured and held prisoner in Germany. But in 1986, a historian researching the 333rd Field Artillery Battalion came to Mississippi. The historian was documenting the Wereth massacre, a crime that had been buried in military archives for over 40 years. Hayes agreed to an interview. He sat in his small house, surrounded by photographs of grandchildren, and told the story of being tied to a post with a sign around his neck. He told the story of a German officer who cut him down, and he said, voice quiet but steady, 11 men I knew died in the snow at Wereth. They were killed because they were black. I lived because one German officer saw me as a soldier, not as a color. Just one man, making one choice. I've thought about that every day for 40 years. The historian asked, "Do you think he was a good man?" Hayes considered the question for a long time. "I don't know if he was good, but he did one good thing. In a war like that, maybe that's all any of us could hope for." Hauptmann Ernst Müller did not survive the winter. On January 8, 1945, near Bastogne, during the final days of the failing German offensive, his unit was caught in an American artillery barrage. The official report listed him as killed in action, struck by shrapnel while directing a tactical withdrawal. He was buried in a military cemetery near Bitburg, alongside thousands of other German soldiers who died in Belgium. No family came to claim the body. His wife had died in an Allied bombing raid on Dresden in 1943. His son was still frozen somewhere in the rubble of Stalingrad. But Feldwebel Klaus Brenner survived, and in 1953, drinking in a Berlin bar with a former comrade, he told a different story. He said Müller had been shot in the back during the retreat. The wound was too precise, too clean to be shrapnel. Brenner suspected an SS reprisal. There had been rumors that Kohl had filed a report naming Müller as politically unreliable, but there was no proof. In the chaos of the final retreat, men died in many ways, and it was easy to disguise murder as combat casualty. Brenner said he had buried Müller himself in the frozen ground before continuing the retreat. He said Müller's last words were, "Tell my son I'm sorry." But Klaus was already dead, so the apology went nowhere. History recorded the Battle of the Bulge as the largest engagement fought by the United States Army in World War II, a desperate German gamble that ultimately failed. 19,000 Americans dead, 47,000 wounded, 23,000 captured. The German losses were comparable, though exact numbers were never verified. The battle delayed the Allied advance by weeks, but did not stop it. By May, Germany had surrendered, the Reich reduced to rubble and ash. History forgot the Verith massacre for 50 years. The 11 African-American soldiers executed on December 17, 1944, were buried quietly. Their families told they died in combat. The crime was documented in army records but never prosecuted at Nuremberg. The evidence was filed away, classified, forgotten. In 1994, a Belgian historian named Henri Rogister discovered the truth while researching local wartime records. He found witness statements from Belgian civilians who had seen the bodies, who had heard the gunshots, who knew what had happened. He fought for recognition, for a memorial, for justice decades too late. In 2004, a monument was finally erected at Wereth. Families came, old now, children and grandchildren, nephews and nieces who had never known the men whose names were carved in stone. They stood in the Belgian winter and remembered. History also recorded that approximately 130,000 American POWs were held in German camps during the war. Of those, 99% survived, a survival rate that testified to Germany's general compliance with Geneva Convention rules for Western prisoners. The calculation was cold but clear. Western POWs had value. They could be used for propaganda, for prisoner exchanges, for post-war negotiations. Their deaths would bring retaliation against German POWs in Allied hands. Soviet POWs fared far worse. 3.3 million captured, 57% dead from deliberate starvation, exposure, execution. They had no value in German calculations. They were Untermensch, subhuman, expendable. African-American prisoners existed in a gray zone between these extremes. Some, like Hayes, were processed correctly and survived. Others were separated, abused, or killed. Treatment varied by unit, by location, by the whims of individual commanders. There were no clear rules when racial ideology conflicted with military pragmatism. Men like Müller represented a tension at the heart of the German military. Soldiers trained in honor codes inherited from Prussia, serving a regime that measured human worth by skull measurements and racial categorization. Most chose compliance over resistance. A few chose open rebellion and died quickly. Fewer still chose the narrow path between preserving fragments of decency within an indecent system. It was never enough. One man saved while millions died, but it was something. A crack in the monolith, proof that individual choice still mattered even in a machine designed to eliminate choice. In 2018, A documentary filmmaker interviewed the last surviving members of the 333rd Field Artillery Battalion. Only 3 remained, all in their 90s, bodies failing but memories sharp. Samuel Turner, sitting in a wheelchair in a Memphis nursing home, remembered James Hayes. Jimmy was smart, quiet. We trained together at Huachuca, got separated during the offensive. Heard later he survived, came home, worked at the mill. At a reunion in the 80s, someone asked how he made it. Jimmy said, "The ones who killed us saw enemies. The ones who saved us saw soldiers. The difference was everything." The filmmaker asked whether that distinction still mattered today. Turner looked at him for a long time, his eyes roomy but fierce. "Son, when people start deciding who counts as human and who doesn't, that's when everything falls apart." Jimmy knew that. He lived it. And if you think the world learned that lesson permanent, you haven't been paying attention. Turner died 6 months later. The documentary aired on PBS to modest viewership. Most people forgot it within a week. But the story remains, carved into stone at Verith, filed in archives at Oberursel, buried in a cemetery at Bitburg. It remains in the space between law and justice, between orders and morality, between what is written and what is done. It remains as a question with no easy answer. What does it mean to do the right thing when the system itself is wrong? Miller saved 1 man. He could not save 11 others, could not stop the war, dismantle the camps, overthrow the regime, could not even save himself. But in a frozen Belgian village, he made a choice to see a human being where others saw only an enemy. And that choice rippled forward through 70 years of history. A small stone thrown into dark water, the circles expanding outward, touching shores we cannot see. There is no moral to this story. History does not offer morals, only facts. The fact is that in December 1944, 11 black soldiers were murdered after surrender. The fact is that 1 black soldier survived because a German officer bent the rules. The fact is that both the murderers and the savior wore the same uniform, served the same flag, fought for the same losing cause. We build monuments to heroes and forget the inconvenient dead. We celebrate the good war, the just war, and bury the parts that complicate the narrative. But the complications are the story, in the gray zones where history is lived, not in the grand strategies but in small choices made by tired men in impossible situations, to cut a rope or walk away, to follow orders or invent new ones, to see a fellow soldier or an enemy. James Hayes lived. Ernst Müller died. The war ended. The world moved on. But in a Belgian village square, if you look closely, you can still see faint marks on a wooden post where wire once bit deep, where charcoal once spelled a word: fiend, enemy. The sign is gone. The word remains. And we are left to decide, each of us, every day, whether we see enemies or human beings. That choice, made 1,000,000 times in 1,000,000 small moments, is what determines whether we are civilized or simply organized killers. History offers no comfort, no redemption, no easy answers. Only the cold facts and the question they pose. What would you have done? If this story made you think about the choices we make in impossible circumstances, about the thin line between following orders and following conscience, then this channel needs your support. Subscribe if you believe these forgotten stories deserve to be remembered. History isn't just about the famous battles and celebrated heroes. It's about the small moments when ordinary people decided whether to see enemies or human beings. Hit the like button if you want more deep dives into the untold stories of World War II, the moral complexities that textbooks skip, and the voices that were silenced for decades. Leave a comment below. What would you have done in Hauptmann Müller's position? Do you think one good act can matter in a system built on injustice? Have you heard other stories like Hayes's that deserve to be told? Your perspective matters. This community thrives on thoughtful discussion, and if you know someone who needs to hear this story, a history teacher, a veteran, a student trying to understand how ordinary people navigate extraordinary evil, share this video. These stories survive only when we refuse to let them be forgotten. The Wereth massacre was buried for 50 years. James Hayes's survival depended on one officer's choice. History is full of moments like these, waiting to be uncovered. Don't let them disappear again. Subscribe, engage, remember. New videos exploring the hidden corners of history drop every week. See you in the next one.